Hello everyone, I am Tessellating Hexagons, and as you can tell by my hat and my generally fabulous attire, he says, leaning awkwardly to stay in the shot, time for another Tess Hex versus Literature. I did say I wanted to get another one of these out before the end of the year, and well, here I am, being fabulous with my floofy arms and all this. As I've mentioned in my recent vlog, I know I mentioned it somewhere on recording, I should, by all rights, be covering Tristan Blackwolf's Grayson's Triad Book 1, but I'm going to wait until I've read the entire trilogy before reviewing that, and books 2 and 3 haven't been written yet, so it's going to be a couple of years before I do that review. I do look forward to reviewing them, because I've got a lot to say, and that's just about the first book, but enough about that. The actual book in the firing line today is Jonathan Stroud's Heroes of the Valley. Now, I have a bit of an interesting history with this book, because I've actually met the author of this book, but not. Like, it sounds more grandiose than it actually is. It was just before the summer of 2009, so I was at the end of year 8 in high school English, United Kingdom stuff. Anyway, it was in an English lesson. We'd done the curriculum for the year. I think we were just filling time between the end of the curriculum and the start of the exam season, I think, or something like that. I don't remember. We were given an excerpt from this book, although, that said, having read the book, I can't actually find the excerpt in there, so I think it was more like flavor text or something, or a summary, or some sort of blurb to get you engaged, but I can't find it anywhere in the book word for word, so that could just be my memory acting up, though. Anyway, we had to do a little bit of reading comprehension with that, and I think the reason why they did that is because, as it is, Jonathan Stroud was already going to make an appearance at the school, and I think they just wanted us to read something by him so that we could, so we actually appreciated the fact that there was an author coming to visit the school. Considering that the assembly itself, where he was present, was held in a part of the school usually reserved for the younger, like the non-high school younger ones, I feel like he had some greater purpose for being there, and we were just sort of thrown in like, yo, you study English, you as an author. And that's, wow, I have rambled too long about this anecdote, but anyway, I didn't actually pick up this book until many, many years later, like last year, maybe the year before, where I saw it somewhere, and I want to say I got it in the same shop as Shipbreaker in Sweden, but no. It was somewhere in the UK, somewhere recently. I believe my mother was with me. And I picked it up because I was like, oh, I remember this book. It was that one book by that one guy who came into school that one time. And so I read it out of curiosity. And I've rambled so much, and I'm not even talking about the bloody book. I don't know where to begin with this review. I'll start, as I normally do, by reading out the blurb on the back and see if that gets you engaged, because according to The Guardian and The Telegraph respectively, this book is quite simply stunning and a real treat, human. Didn't know Callum wrote for The Telegraph. Okay, so, listen then, and I'll tell you again of the Battle of the Rock. Hallie loves to hear stories from the days when the valley was a wild and dangerous place, besieged by the bloodthirsty Trows. He likes to imagine the night the legendary heroes joined together and defeated the ancient foe. Nowadays, heroics seem a thing of the past, but when a practical joke rekindles an old blood feud, Hallie spots a chance for a quest of his own. Together with Ord, a girl just as fearless as he is, he begins an epic adventure. Soon, they will challenge everything they've ever known and uncover the truth about the legends, the valley, and themselves. Now, that didn't initially grab me. Like, as I said, the only reason I picked up this book in the first place was, oh, I vaguely remember this, I wonder what the actual story behind it was, because we'd only got, as I said, a sort of flavor text introduction to it. And I will admit, going into this book, I was still jaded from Shipbreaker, because this is, I suppose, also young adult fiction, and as I said, Shipbreaker was also young adult fiction, but painfully so, and so I was kind of jaded. I somehow had lodged it in my head that, oh no, now that I'm 19, all young adult fiction is going to read like total crap. I'm not saying that Shipbreaker was total crap, but you want to watch my review about that? Go right ahead, it's in this playlist somewhere. As young adult fiction goes, this is actually pretty good. What? Young adult fiction can be good? Oh my goodness, my faith in humanity has been restored. The story itself, as the intro, the blurb should indicate, it has the feel of Norse mythology to it. Maybe not mythology so much as a Norse legend of heroes kind of thing. And it very much reads like one as well. It's got relatively, not archaic terminology, but like it reads like you're reading a legend as opposed to a modern book. That's what I'm trying to say. And that actually really works well, especially considering its ending, but I'll get to the ending when I get to the ending. And I've already got to the ending in reading, but when I get to analysing it. The story has an interesting dynamic in that at the start of every chapter, you have a little bit of italicized text that's an excerpt from these legendary heroes' tales that the protagonist, Hallie, has actually been told. His inspiration as a protagonist is to be like these legendary heroes from back in the day, all of whom have very Nordic-sounding names. This is another thing. It's really rather helpful that the book has like an index of the most important characters in the book, so in case you ever forget who's who, you can just turn back to page 0 and there you go, there's a list of important characters. And it also includes a map of the valley in which the book takes place, which is really useful because I'm shit at imagining things, and I imagined it the other way up. The start of the story is roughly up here, and it takes him down towards the right, and then back up to the left again. As I said, really useful information because I can't visualize this sort of stuff in my head, but yes. So each chapter begins with an excerpt from the legends telling of these old heroes, Svein, Eirik, Egil, Arn, Håkon, Orm, Erland, Kjetil. I'm pronouncing it the Nordic way because I'm guessing they just didn't put in, like, for instance, because there. So 12 legendary heroes. They did their heroics back in the day, they've slipped into the pages of legend, and now the land is divided up into 12 houses, each governed by the successors of those ancient heroes, their descendants. And so we've got the House of Svein, which is led by the Sveinsons, and Hallie is of the Sveinsson line. I'm pronouncing it Svein because EI in German and Norwegian is pronounced I, so it could be Svein or Sveen or I don't know, but I'm going to call him Svein and deal with it. The primary antagonist house, as it were, because Svein's house finds itself at odds with Håkon's house. And I'm pronouncing it like that because I'm assuming they didn't want to put an A with a ring above it in a young adult book because for English, like, bearing in mind how arrogant English speakers are, there's no way they'd bother to look up how to pronounce the letter or, which is A with a ring above it. So I'm assuming a lot of people are going to read through this book and be like, oh, the bad guys are the Hexagons. Like, no, this is Håkon, because that's like a name in Danish, I think. So there we go. So, for the third time, each chapter begins with an excerpt from the old legends, which may or may not be pertinent to the actual events of that chapter. And so we actually gain some insight into Hallie's inspiration and what drives him, because he's the youngest of 3 children of the Sveinsson household. He has an older sister and an older brother, and obviously, being as he is the spare to his older brother's heir, he's not really got much of a future, bearing in mind the book goes into great detail over and over again to berate him for how he's short and ugly and I don't know, stuff like that. So he's not got much going for him. And he lives in a society where the heroics and all that the heroes did back in the day has since been outlawed in order to maintain peace, which makes sense, I suppose, that for instance, making swords is illegal. That kind of thing. They're sort of forcibly keeping the peace, so that the things the heroes did back in the day shouldn't be repeated, so that sort of thing. They're moved into a relatively more modern legal system where feuds are resolved by suing each other rather than by fighting each other, which has its own merits, I suppose. But there are people like Hallie and, as it turns out, the Håkonsons, who still hold on to the ideals of the heroes from back in the day, who are still bloodthirsty, who still want to, kill people, that they're still a bit fighty, still a little bit murdery. We have some insight into what drives Hallie's imagination and how he thinks he's going to behave. And an interesting point of it is all these legends that we read as chapter introductions are told from the perspective of what a Sveinsson would hear, because as it turns out, as we read through the book, there are all these legends about the heroes, but of course the most heroic one just so happens to be the hero that founded the house of the person telling the story. So in the Sveinsson house, it's Svein that does all these great deeds. In Arn's house, it's Arn that does all the great things, and it's Svein who's this bumbling sidekick. And it's like that between all the houses. There is some, not enmity, but each one has delusions of grandeur. And we happen to read it all from the perspective of Svein, and that's kind of another thing that makes me question the ending, but once again, I'll reach that when I reach that. So we have an insight into the stuff that motivates Hallie in the first place, a combination of the legends of old, delusions of how great his house is, and something else. I forget where this train of thought was going, because I've got sidetracked by the notion that each house is distinctly different, in that Hallie, being the youngest child, doesn't travel much, and so he thinks his house is the greatest because of all the legends saying, oh, insert name here is the greatest hero. Oh, your Svine's house? Well, it's Svine that's the greatest hero. So he believes that his house is the greatest one. And then he ends up travelling down the valley, eventually ending up at Håkon's house, where he realises that actually Svine's is the remotest, the tiniest, literally the shittiest. And that's a bit of a reality check for him. But he doesn't question the old legends, at least not for quite some time. I will say the pacing of it, because the book itself is divided into 4 acts. I do question where the borders between acts lie, but for the most part it makes a lot of sense, because Act 1, more or less, is introduction of Hallie and his background and the story and how it all starts. There's this an annual, what they call gathering. I suppose it's kind of like American Thanksgiving, where all the houses come together at one host, which is a different one each year, and then they celebrate with food and stuff. And Hallie ends up poisoning the Håkonsons because they were rude to him, and stuff happens. Act 2 is, well, I'm not, somewhere between Acts 1 and 2. The Håkonsons are invited to Svine's house after the end of the gathering as some sort of sorry you accidentally got poisoned while you were here feast. It makes a lot more sense in context, trust me. While they're there, the Håkonsons are really kind of rude, and ultimately someone does get a little bit stabbed to death. So Hallie sets out to revenge kill, like pretty much the same day or the day after, or so. No, it's a short time after the Håkonsons head home. Hallie decides to run away from home and chase after them with the intent of killing the one that got a little bit stabby during the feast. And Act 2 is his journey all the way down the valley, from the very top at Svine's house to the very bottom at Håkon's house, or more or less. And I think between Acts 2 and 3, stuff happens. He may or may not go through with the killing. People may or may not die. Bearing in mind, Hallie is, like, 15, so I'll leave it to your imagination whether he actually does do the deed or not. But still, things happen. Håkon's house ends up catching fire, and he has to kind of run away because the Håkons already hate him. And kind of burning their house won't exactly help that, so Act 3 is him fleeing from the Håkonsons across the valley, back up in a roundabout sort of way, because on the way down, in Act 2, he's attacked by a trader who's actually a thief. And the trader tries to kill him, and so he fights back. The trader falls off a cliff. Hallie blames himself for this trader dying, but it turns out that this trader was also a really respected man of Eric's house, I think it was. And so he has to completely avoid that house on the way back up. He ends up at Arn's house, which is the home of Ord, the friend of his from the back of the book. Basically, Act 3 is him being a fugitive and trying to get home, and then it turns out that the Håkonsons have declared war on Svine's house, and they have basically the winter to prepare, because the top of the valley is pretty much inaccessible during winter because of all the snow and ice and whatever. Then, Act 4, spring comes, the Håkonsons arrive early, there's a bit of a bloodbath, and then there's a thing that happens that it's a fairly major plot point that I've completely glossed over, but according to the laws of the heroes, the residents of the valley cannot leave the valley because otherwise they'll be eaten by these monsters called Trows, and I believe it is pronounced Trow, could be Tro, but I'm fairly sure that when Jonathan Stroud was at the school he pronounced it Trow. I could be wrong, bearing in mind that was 2009, which was over 6 years ago now, 6.5 years I think. They're told not to leave the valley because they're going to get eaten by these nocturnal monsters. And Ord starts to make Hallie question whether they even exist. And ultimately, their final throw in this war against the Håkonsons is to lead them up out of the valley so that the Trows eat them. But then, and this is the ending I was building up to, so Hallie and Ord are up there outside of the valley by themselves, while these bloodthirsty monsters kind of kill their enemies for them. But then these monsters are also coming after Hallie and Ord as well, because they left the valley, they broke the rules of the ancients, which is actually more real than they gave them credit for. When they're confronted by the Trows, they realise what the Trows actually are, and it's at that point that I start to question what the end... Like, the way the ending's written, I'm not doubting its quality, but I'm doubting whether or not it actually happens, whether or not we have an unreliable narrator on our hands, because the epilogue of the book reads just like the legends that precede each chapter and finish every act, except it talks about what happens after the end of the actual story, so we could assume that the entire book is actually one of these legends being told to Hallie's descendants or whoever. And so I do wonder whether the ending is an embellishment of that, or whether it's a certain character's dying dreams, because at one point there is a battle that Hallie and Ord and others, who I will not name for spoiler reasons, are involved in, and one of them suffers a blow to the chest with a sword that should by all rights be fatal, and whoever it is that's attacked does die, but then they're not dead because of a piece of armor they were wearing, despite the fact that the sword supposedly went right through them, but then suddenly the sword only stopped at this armor that they were wearing. And so I do wonder whether the ending was just that character's dying dreams, or whether the whole thing is just an embellished version of the legend. I don't know exactly what it is, but I like the fact that it ends on that note, that you can still speculate what's going on. So I realised that this past 20 minutes has basically just been me recapping the book, but that kind of shows it's more memorable than I gave it credit for. It's better written than I was anticipating, and the pacing is actually pretty much spot on. And it reads like a Norse legend because that's either what it is or what it's certainly trying to be, and it succeeds in doing that. And as I said, the pacing's perfect because 4 acts, and the 4 acts are really well divided because it's introduction, journey down valley, then journey back up valley as fugitive, and then fighty foo-foo. It's really well structured. I didn't think it was going to be. So, maximum credit to this book. Here and there are a couple of words that sound like they don't quite fit in. I don't know whether that's for the sake of the young adults reading. I'm making hand gestures you can't quite see. Or whether it's just Jonathan Stroud momentarily breaking character by accident, or I don't know. There are some words that don't quite fit in, but I can overlook them. Overall, I'm going to give this book an 8 out of 10, because I'm sure it does have some flaws, but from the way it's written, the pacing of it, the story it tells, there's not much I can fault about it. There are some questions that I could raise about, Hallie's motivations, or why events play out the way they do, but then again, if the whole story is just the same ilk as the embellished legends that precede every chapter, then that actually makes more sense in hindsight, that the whole thing is kind of an exaggerated version of what actually happened, and we'll never know what actually happened because it's all in the past, much like the stories of the heroes. So in short, it's actually worth reading because it's better than I thought it would be. So yeah, 8 out of 10, enjoyable book. Yeah. So, that was an interesting little blast inspired by my past. I have been and will continue to be Tessellating Hexagons. That was a book. See you in the next video of mine that you choose to watch. I realise this was abrupt, but I've been talking for 20 minutes about not too much. Like, I literally just recapped the events of the book. But hey, bye!